Good day, comrades. Today we talk about glorious Great Patriotic War and the glorious Soviet victory over Nazi Germany and why this made us distrustful of our Western allies. And I'm sorry that's as far as I'm going to keep that accent going because otherwise I'll crack myself up. But what we're going to do today is, in brief, and for those of you that had my World War II course, get ready. I'm about to crunch 16 weeks or 2 weeks into a 50-minute lecture. But what I want to talk about is the Second World War, some of the political events, as well as from the Soviet perspective. And the reason I want to do this is because the Second World War is key for laying what I believe are the two most important parts you need to have a Cold War. Okay? Capitalism and communism have never liked each other. That's kind of what we went over last time. By the way, I apologize for the lighting. It's a cloudy day here in glorious Stillwater. So even though I've got my wonderful floodlight, the lighting kind of sucks. So I'm hoping it'll probably change mid-video because, yay, Oklahoma weather. But the two have never really liked each other. Okay? But it doesn't matter when the Soviet Union, throughout the 1920s and 1930s, is kind of this backwoods country, this technologically backward, small military, not really a player on the global scale. It just doesn't matter. But take the Second World War, where you now have a resurgent Soviet Union becoming a technological powerhouse, expanding its borders, and now being a world power. Take that and then have the adoption, the usage, and deployment of atomic weapons. And that's the witch's brew to make a Cold War. You now have a capitalist army over here, a communist army over here. One of the two has atomic weapons, and that could potentially be a bad day for everyone. So we left off talking about the Spanish Civil War. I briefly mentioned that German cooperation with the Soviet Union that extends all the way to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939. So you, in effect, have Germany and the Soviet Union cooperating. Now, this was not done for mutual trust. This is pretty much, Stalin realizes he's literally murdered half his army. Okay, the Great Purges, anyone about major rank or above had been executed. The Soviet army has no command structure. It cannot fight a war. The Soviets also get the idea that despite what they're arguing, the British and French do not want to try to limit German expansion. So what all of this is going to mean is the Soviets realize, hey, a war is coming. Let's placate the Germans. This is kind of the ultimate appeasement. Placate the Germans and buy time. Now, out of that comes something controversial. When Germany invades Poland on September the 1st, 1939, 2 weeks later, the Soviets will cross the border and also invade Poland on September 17. Okay, so a little over 2 weeks later. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact specified that the two would actually cooperate in Poland and divvy up Poland. And the thing is, this is controversial because even today in Russia, okay, there was a case a year or two ago of a Russian historian who brought this up and he was jailed because they treated it as sedition. No, you can't mention that we actually cooperated with the Nazis. The Putin government does not want to admit, hey, yeah, actually, the Soviet Union worked with the Germans. Well, here's photographic evidence. German soldiers in Poland schmoozing it up with the crew of a Soviet BT-5 light tank. And the fact is, it's actually this two-pronged assault that breaks the back of the Polish army. Could the Poles have stood against the Germans? Of course not. But they had more of a chance, or could have prolonged the war, bought time for Anglo-French participation, had they not been stabbed in the back. Now, what we see is there's not that much fighting. I mean, the Poles do fight, but in general, they say, okay, hey, let's just retreat, surrender to the Soviet Union, pretty much, because they realize, hey, the Germans, it's going to be worse. And again, if you've taken my World War II course, and if you've not, I hope to see you this autumn. For the Germans invading Poland, That's a war of extermination. That is the extension of Lebensraum. This idea, okay, we're going to create German colonies in Poland, and to do that, you have to murder the population. But the fact is, Soviet occupation, while better, I mean, it's not great. In fact, the Soviets are going to do war crimes as well. We see they're going to occupy, if you look at the map, technically, it's about half the country, square mileage. It might actually be a little over half the country. But again, it's enough that the Polish resistance is broken. And despite whatever the Putinist government wants to say, there is clear cooperation between the Germans and the Soviets. They take in about 230,000 prisoners. And what's interesting, okay, and this kind of sets the tone for the rest of World War II, Britain and France do not like the Soviet Union. But there's no declaration of war. Think about it. Why does the Second World War break out? It's because Britain and France have an alliance to protect Poland. Germany has violated that. Well, okay, there you get your declaration of war. But the Soviet Union has also violated that. But there is no declaration of war because the British and French realize they cannot fight the Soviets and the Germans at the same time. Politically, we're going to retcon this. If you can, it's actually on YouTube. If you've been in my World War II class again, you've seen this. But there's an episode of Why We Fight, which was this documentary series put out by Frank Capra in World War II. And the idea was it was supposed to educate American soldiers. What are the Nazis? What are the fascists? Totalitarian Japanese. How did the war start? Here's a brief history of the war up until we get involved circa 1943. And they actually mention this. They mention the Soviet invasion of Poland. And what they literally say, I'm not even kidding, is the Soviets invaded Poland not to conquer it, but to help the Poles and to tell Hitler, no, you can't advance any further. They are the first ones to stand up and say no to Nazi aggression. That could not be further from the truth. That's not why they do it. This was just as much a land grab. And we can see that when you factor in that part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact also put much of the Baltic in the Soviet sphere of influence. The Germans would get memo, but the Soviets, very quickly, okay, they invade Poland September 17. September 28, they annex Estonia. October 5, they annex Latvia. October 10, they annex Lithuania. And what we see, the Soviets, although prepping, realizing a war with Germany was going to happen, still took this as a time to expand their sphere of influence. Why? Because they don't trust the West. Germany, for better or for worse, had been the only power to acknowledge their existence, acknowledge they had a right to exist, and were willing to work with them. And they made the most of it. And again, the Soviets, it's still a repressive regime. And again, out of this, we can see another tenet. Okay? They're going to deport about 1.7 million Poles, most of Siberia and Kazakhstan. Okay, this is kind of a war crime. But nobody says anything. Nobody can stop it. They just let it happen. Stalin's killing his own people. Come on. In April and May 1940, the Soviets begin a systemic massacre of Polish military officers, policemen, politicians, known anti-communist personnel. Basically gather them together and execute them in the Katyn forest. And they do this because they don't want a resurgent Poland. One of the things we're going to see with Poland in World War II is, as with so many other countries, a government in exile. But Poland is kind of unique in the sense that it, and I believe Czechoslovakia, will actually form two governments in exile. One in the West that's more pro-British, pro-democracy, and then one centered in the Soviet Union that is, pro-communism. The Soviets want to ensure that Poland doesn't rise up. Now, when this is discovered after Operation Barbarossa, when the Germans invade, okay, when this is discovered, the Germans more or less put pictures of this on display and say, look what the Soviets are doing. We have evidence that this is Soviet brutality. This is why we invaded. We invaded because somebody has to put a stop to this. Now, obviously, they do it in part to shield their own war crimes, both against the Poles and against the Soviets. And understand, the Germans are going to be absolutely brutal to the Slavic people. But what's important about this, and if you want to understand why in late 45 things go to hell and relatively quickly, the Allies know of the massacre. They know of Katyn. If you read the documents, okay, exchange between Roosevelt and Churchill, they knew the Soviets did it. They knew the extent to which it was done. But they have to preserve the alliance with the Soviet Union. Understand, I, like any other, would love to go, America, we won the war. But the fact is, the war in Europe is won in the Soviet Union. The sheer numbers of troops deployed are nothing short of mind-boggling. That's where the war is won. And Churchill and Roosevelt, no matter how much they might have hated the damn commies, okay, they knew, I'm trying to adjust my technical difficulties, they knew that alliance had to be preserved, because if the Soviets were to knuckle under, or God forbid, switch sides to the Germans, okay, then that's it. That's the ballgame. There's no way you're going to get ashore in Festung Europa, Fortress Europe. So they preserve the alliance. But understand, this was always uneasy. This is an alliance of convenience. As soon as the necessity is done, then that's it. The alliance is going to quickly fall apart. Now, what I'd like to do is impress upon you why the Soviets are distrustful. So I just really quickly want to begin talking about, the war from the Soviet perspective. So on June the 22nd, 1941, the Germans invade. This is Operation Barbarossa. This is the largest land invasion in history. Now understand, this is going to be absolutely devastating for the Soviet Union. Stalin is paranoid. Stalin does not want to believe that Germany will do this. Why? The Soviets are sending millions of tons of food to Germany. They're sending, barrels upon barrels of oil to Germany. Germany has just sold them a heavy cruiser, the Lutzow, which has not been finished yet, but there's this whole military and technical cooperation going on between the two countries. Soviet spies said, yes, the Germans are planning this. American spies, literally the American ambassador goes to Stalin and says, look, we have evidence. You're going to be invaded. Stalin says, no. The Germans crash through the border, and the Soviet army is completely unprepared. Yes, they do have the wonderful T-34 and KV-1 tanks, but not nearly enough of them in 1941. They cannot stand against the Germans, who have better training, better doctrine, better equipment, better aircraft, better everything. The Soviets have more men, and that is true. They have more tanks, literally about 3 times the number. But their tanks are old, crappy types, such as that BT-5 that was in Poland. Okay, many are these old, like T-26s, that are based off an early 1930s British tank. They're not that good. With the result that by 1941, the Germans make it to about, 18 kilometers from Moscow. Lead German reconnaissance units and their Panzerspähwagens, their armored cars, can literally, through the binoculars, see the spires of the Kremlin. 7 million Soviet troops have been wounded, captured, killed. Entire Soviet armies have been destroyed. And if you look, this is on this map, this is a pretty good chunk of Soviet territory. The Germans almost carry this off. Now, are the Germans ever going to conquer Russia? Of course not. The thing is, okay, You might take Moscow, but you've got like 10 other time zones you've got to go through. If the Soviets have proven anything, okay, and they would date this back to Napoleon. I mean, they literally look to 1812. Okay, there's a reason in 1944, one of their operations, Operation Bagration, who named after Prince Bagration, who had helped lead the defense of Moscow in 1812. Okay, just keep falling back. Scorched earth tactics. Deny the enemy the use of whatever he has captured. And so they're going to blunt it. And the Soviets have two allies that have been successful in every conventional war they've ever fought. General Winter, better known as General December, and General January. German tanks don't work in sub-zero temperatures. German tanks, literally, to get them started, as it would freeze to the ground, you would have to build fires under the tank and kind of roast your tank to warm it up. Periscope vision blocks in the tanks would freeze. Bolts would freeze on rifles so you couldn't open them. Literally, men and machine stopped working. And I should say German men and machine. The Soviets were used to this. The Soviets had winter clothing. And so the Soviets pushed them back. And what we're going to see, this is going to be a long and bloody war. The Soviets call it the Great Patriotic War, to make it every citizen's duty. And this war does what Stalin could not do. Stalin could not unify the Soviet people. Okay, the Ukrainians did not like Stalin. They welcomed the Nazis as liberators until the Nazis started shooting them, looting them, burning their crops. The people of Belorussia, White Russia, did not like the Soviet Union. They too were willing to do this. But then you have the Germans, and you have somebody worse than Stalin. And Stalin recategorizes the war. He says it's the duty of every person to get into the conflict, every person to fight. He makes it all-inclusive. It's not about Russia or Ukrainian or Belarusian, but it's about Soviet being one and the same. And this inspires a new level of fanatical zeal, which is why, despite, things like Enemy at the Gates, where you see the commissar, shooting troops that just don't want to attack, which that does happen. Okay, you still have to have Comrade Commissar with his 1895 Nagant revolver, should have set mine out here, urging his troops forward. And, anybody who, didn't want to go would get a bullet to the head. That did happen. But it also inspires that fanatical zeal, where Soviet troops routinely, not always, but routinely, refused to wear helmets. Why? That 5 pounds of steel can better go to a tank. And if you can get 10,000 guys to say, no, that's however much steel it needs to make those helmets, you can then put into tank production, or put into artillery production, or to make shells, or do something else. It inspires the fanatical zeal that as Soviet troops run forward with their Mosin Nagant's bayonets fixed, they cry, Za Rodina, for the motherland. The fanatical zeal that on the sides of the tanks, okay, people who might, even Ukrainians, who are starving to death in the collectivization of the farms, who might have hated Stalin, will write Za Stalina on their tanks for Stalin. This unifies the Soviet people. It's this that will create now a unified nation working as one with one common goal. And that's why very quickly you're going to go from 1939, when the Soviet Union, although vast, although with huge population resources, is not a world player, at least not a major one. And it will go to be one of the only two superpowers. The other unifying factor is the Germans do all sorts of war crimes. Remember, this is still that idea of Lebensraum. Okay? If we're going to set up colonies, you've got to shoot people. And I feel bad. I love making jokes about the Cold War. Can't really joke about this because the Eastern Front literally sucks. Okay, there's a reason why it becomes stereotypical cliche in World War II movies that if a German soldier screws up, then whoop, it's off to the Russian front. That was seen as punishment. Okay, We see German Einsatzgruppen, which are members of the SS, coming in and beginning shooting men, women, and children of these villages. They began targeting Jews, as well as even just Soviet civilians. They use torture and they use rape. This is basically genocide towards the Jews and ethnic cleansing towards the Soviet Union. Because in the Nazi perspective, okay, Slavs, which even meant the Russian people, are seen as Untermensch, subhuman. They are, different, they're apart, they're not even human. And it's in fact that hubris that will undo them. Because on the one hand, okay, from this part, these war crimes unify the Soviet people. Okay, if the Germans are going to burn down the village, you might as well burn it down and deny them the resources. If the Germans are going to shoot you, okay, then you might as well throw in with Stalin, because there's a chance that Stalin won't. There's also the fact the Germans ignore sound military planning. By having this idea of Untermensch, subhumans, they believe that the Soviets are not going to be able to adequately fight. They believe they have the best military in the world. Remember, and I know, okay, fine, we can make a joke because we're going to move away from the Eastern Front really quickly. In the world of 1940, France had been the military power. Never mind Britain. Okay, never mind Germany. France was the military power. We're talking dating back to Napoleon. We're talking it had fought valiantly in World War I. They have the best trained army in theory. They have more tanks, better tanks. And the Germans overrun them in 6 weeks. This is no surprise to Americans. Why? Because raise one hand if you like the French, raise both hands if you are French. I know, bad joke, but I got to do something to liven it up. The Germans look at that and they say, we overran France in 6 weeks. Why will Russia be any different? We can also look to World War I. Remember, the Russians are the ones who surrender first in World War I. The French never do. So let's use bad logic. If this time the French surrender, surely the Soviets must surrender. And why? Because they are Untermensch. But the fact is, the Soviets frustrate the Germans at every turn. And these war crimes alienate what could have been willing participants. Okay? The Ukrainians might have defected in droves to fight Stalin. Okay? The Belarusians, similarly, those who had been victims of the purges. But instead, the Germans push all of them into the camp of the Soviet Union. We can see the tide turns at Stalingrad in 1942 and 1943, when the Germans throw everything into one last bid, where now Hitler, taking direct control of the army, says, okay, we're not going to take Moscow, that's stupid. Instead, let's deprive the Soviet Union of its materiel. If we cut off the flow of oil, then the Soviet tanks don't work and we must surely win the war. We see then, and consider this, as we're talking about this, think a couple of things. One, we're going to talk about, politics here in a second, but think of Soviet participation in World War II. Think of what they're willing to do, such as Order Number 227, not one step back, which basically said, wherever you are, you will stay there and you will fight and you will die if necessary. In Stalingrad, they say, no, civilians are not allowed to retreat. Civilians are going to stay there even as the city is besieged and surrounded. Why? Because troops are going to fight harder for a live city, not an unoccupied city. If you know, while you're fighting at Dom Pavlov's house, we're literally in this house. You've got it. There are Soviet troops up here at the top floors of the building, German troops here, and they fight for, weeks on end. And in fact, that house is preserved, and it gets its name from Sergeant Pavlov, who was leading the cut-off Russian troops who refused to surrender. If you can have that in a conventional war, what happens if it goes nuclear? Okay, if you're already willing to sacrifice cities for the glory of the motherland, if you're willing to issue order not one step back with the idea that if you retreat, you're stood up against the wall and shot, or you'd be thrown into a penal battalion. And what a penal battalion basically is, oh, we need that minefield cleared. We're not going to send mine tanks. We're going to send you, penal battalion guys, with sticks to go find mines. Okay? And if it blows up and kills you, sucks to be you. Okay? If they're willing to do that, what could happen in a nuclear exchange? Who would be more willing to accept losses? Look at the casualties. 850,000 Germans. This is in the Battle of Stalingrad. Okay, this is August the 23rd, 42 to February the 2nd, 43. 850,000 German. 1.2 million. That's dead and wounded. Okay. This, by the way, these numbers on both sides. For the Soviet, it's about 5 times, and the German about 3 times the numbers killed in Hiroshima. Okay? Understand, add nuclear bombs to this level of fanaticism, and that can be a bad day for everybody. Now, why these are important, if we look at these battles, if we look at the fact the Germans, something like 5 million Soviet soldiers dead in the Holocaust, or actually, and all the millions of prisoners of war. There's something like 10 million dead. The 10 million, that's military, 10 million or so civilian. They believe they had done most of the fighting. They believed they had a right at the peace table. They believed they had a right in future world negotiations. And they're paranoid about future invasions. If you want to know why there's an Iron Curtain, why there's a Berlin Wall, and why they were willing to back their threats with nuclear weapons, okay, it's because they saw what happened the last time something changed in the West. They saw what happened the last time some dictator got a hold of a country in the West. For them, they were not going to let this happen again. They were never going to get to a point where they were going to be invaded and their country thoroughly destroyed. And so nuclear weapons gives them the ability, okay, to project their power and influence. And it's what is the whole goal of nuclear weapons? A nuclear weapon, the best use of it is that it's never used. It's deterrent. Don't piss me off, and I don't drop a nuke on you. Okay? Well, they certainly have reasons to not want to get pissed off, and that's basically what it's going to be. And if I haven't made this comment already about this class, it's kind of hilarious because this whole class is literally about the longest pissing contest in human history. That's basically what the Cold War is. Now, it's that way for very good reasons, but that's what it boils down to. Two nations that become increasingly paranoid that one wants to destroy the other. And the reason that, and where that paranoia starts is right here. Because the Soviets blame Britain and France. Why? Britain and France could have stopped Hitler. Okay, stepping back into the larger political sphere, who is it that doesn't stop them when they remilitarize the Rhineland? Who is it that doesn't stop them when they annex Austria? Who is it that doesn't stop them when they rearm? Who is it that's at the Munich conference and gives away Czechoslovakia? Who is it that doesn't stop them when they invade the rest of Czechoslovakia? They blame Britain and France. And who are the allies of Britain and France? The United States. Now, against that paranoia, okay, understand, this is, although a stressful alliance, although a tenuous alliance, it is an alliance backed by good faith. Okay, the fact is, if you look in the West, we'll put out cards like this. This man is your friend. He fights for freedom. Or things like this showing, the Soviet soldier and the American officer and the British Tommy all working together to, step on Hitler's butt, apparently. Okay? We're trying to cement that alliance. There's a really good movie it's one of my favorites, Action in the North Atlantic. And it's about American convoys to Murmansk, because we're sending them stuff. Planes, tanks, spam, all this stuff. And why I mention it is at the end of the movie, when they get close to Murmansk, they hear planes, and, they've just been attacked by German planes. They're all skittish. They see it's Soviet, like, Soviet planes, yay! You see the Soviet pilot, and he waves, and he's smiling, and he says something in Russian that nobody can understand, but he says it with a smile on his face, so you assume it's not death to the imperialists. And it shows cooperation. And it shows him pulling the mask, and yeah, everybody's happy, yeah. In the 1950s, when that movie was re-aired, they cut all that out. You want to play up that Soviet alliance in World War II. But as soon as it's done, you want to have, what's the term I've heard? Collective amnesia that we were ever on the side of the Soviet Union. Okay? And we still see that today, to a point. What is it, a Donald Trump tweet? Or was it Donald Trump? No, it was Sean Hannity, I believe, was trying to play down the Russian hacking, play down that Russia is the main bad guy. And he made the point, who were our allies in World War II? Okay? In the Cold War, and since we've been so, and I'm not saying I'm a fan of Russian hacking, but we're so focused on Russia as the bad guys, we tend to want to collectively forget this kind of images where we worked arm in arm, where we sent our planes and our tanks and our food and everything we could to help keep them in the war. Because this is an alliance of convenience, okay? What is it? Again, Nikita Khrushchev says without spam, the Soviet army would have lost the war. But the fact is, everybody, including them, wants to forget it. It doesn't play into the narrative. It doesn't play into the narrative that capitalism and communism can't coexist when you have evidence that it most certainly can. Not to mention Churchill himself is still very much anti-communist. Churchill would love if the Nazis and the communists would just kill everyone, and then, the United States and Britain can then divvy up the post-war world. That would have been his ideal scenario. Now, what we see is by 1943, as it's obvious that the Germans can be checked, okay? If we look by May 1943, what do we have? The tide has turned in the Pacific with the Battle of Midway and the Battle of Guadalcanal. In the Mediterranean, North Africa has fallen, the German Afrika Korps has surrendered, and the Germans lose the 6th Army at Stalingrad. Okay, the Germans have suffered 2 massive defeats that they're not going to be able to recover from. It's obvious that at some point the Allies are going to win. So what we then see is we now need to start talking from 1943 perspective, what's going to happen in the post-war world. We see that Stalin, for very good reasons, wants a second front. Again, the Soviets are losing men hand over fist. They're pushing the Germans out of the Soviet Union. And he says, we need a second front. But the fact is, the British do not have the manpower, and the United States is still getting trained up. Understand, the Germans have been doing this for years, 39, 40, 41, 42. Okay, as we try at Dieppe, okay, in 1942, if we try to invade in France, that's just not going to work. So we land in North Africa, we fight in North Africa, and that helps. But it's not getting at the second front that Stalin wants, and Stalin is getting more and more angry. Now, FDR, here's where we see from the Western Alliance the 2 perspectives on how to deal with the Soviet Union. Churchill, as I said, wants to wait. Churchill is anti-communist. Remember, it had been Winston Churchill that had organized the, actions in the Middle East, Arkhangelsk, Siberia, trying to help the whites in the Russian Civil War. For him, he thought if we can delay the second front, if we can even let the Soviets do most of the fighting, let the Germans have a free hand to fight them, maybe the 2 will kill each other and it'll be a cakewalk for us. However, Roosevelt, his idea, let's go ahead and show the big 3 turn on. Roosevelt's idea, and this is kind of why he would more often sit next to Stalin, was show good faith. He realized that, yes, these are the 3 nations that are going to dominate the post-war sphere. If we show good faith now, if we can earn Stalin's trust, then Stalin might not want to fight with us post-war, and capitalism and communism can coexist. That was Roosevelt's thought. So Roosevelt is always pushing, let's do something, let's have a second front. So he pushes for Italy in September 43. and then finally gets Churchill to agree in June 44, D-Day, invading France. And that was more of a case of, we're going to invade France. You can help if you want, but we're going to do this. And for the Soviets, it didn't come a moment too soon. They wanted it even sooner. That was kind of an awkward turn of phrase. They agree to invade France. It takes until Tehran. It takes till the end of 1943. And what we see is, okay, they say, if we do this, Soviet Union, will you declare war against Japan? And the Soviets have a non-aggression pact with Japan. That's why Japan honestly believes that they're going to be safe from a Soviet attack. Now, what we see is, in these early conferences, the Soviets always have the upper hand. Because the Soviets are looking to expand. They want buffer states. So if this ever happens again, okay, somebody has to go through Poland and Latvia and Estonia. That gives the Soviet Union time to prepare. And so we get things like, okay, we're going to redraw Poland. We're literally going to move the nation to the west. We're going to move the western border of Germany, or the eastern border of eastern border of Germany further to the west. Churchill and FDR both push for free elections. And this is going to be a common theme all the way up till 1989. Free elections in Europe, but the Soviets never commit. Because the fact is, as the Soviets have the bigger army, as they are doing the bulk of the fighting, you cannot tick them off. You cannot alienate the Soviets. So again, we see this a lot. Churchill wants to drag his feet. FDR wants confidence building. And we see out of all of this, we get the idea they know the war is going to end. They don't know when. They don't know how soon. But they have to start looking further. And we start getting this idea. How are we going to divide Germany? We're going to talk about that a lot next time. A lot with our division of Germany. I've got some cool handouts. Some cool documents I'll show off. But, again, that's next time. Now, while this is happening, understand the irony of World War II is, from the Allied perspective, it starts for one goal. It starts for the idea of wanting free elections in Europe. Or not free elections, but a free Poland. The idea is Germany has invaded Poland. We say that's bad, and by we I mean Britain. So Britain then, says, okay, we're going to go to war to provide a free Poland. That is the one thing they do not get. The Soviets are going to dominate Poland, okay, all the way up until the 1980s. Now, part of this issue we see is the issue of governments in exile. Who are the rightful governments of these occupied countries? We see Polish troops fighting with Britain since 1940. Okay, there are free Polish troops, army, ground units. There are Polish pilots flying Hawker Hurricanes in the Battle of Britain, and the British recognize this government. But there's also the Lublin Committee, which are Polish troops that had been captured by the Soviets, that then organized. The Soviets say, okay, here's guns, here's weapons, here's tanks, we'll let you form a Polish army, you're just going to do what we say. And there's the simple issue of geography. Britain can say that their Poles are the rightful leaders. But when the Soviets recapture Poland and the Lublin Committee is right there, okay, there's not much the West can do. I mean, it's easy to say, okay, hey, our Poles are the rightful leaders, but you actually have Poland. I mean, there's not much you can actually do. And I thought it lightened up. So what we see is there's just this, I don't know why what we see is apparently my phrase nowadays, but there's just this constant back and forth. Who is going to control in Eastern Europe? And remember, the Allied perspective, free elections, democracy, republicanism. The Soviet perspective, however, we want satellite states. We want nations that are friendly, that are sympathetic, and can honestly be used as road bumps if a resurgent Germany ever does this again. And we see that really codified at Yalta in 1945, the last time the big three meet. And if you look, this is February. Roosevelt is not looking that good, and he's going to be dead 2 months later. Okay, this is the last time the wartime big three meet. And what we see here is the defeat of Germany. By this point, they know it's all but inevitable. I mean, American troops are fighting in Germany, Soviet troops are fighting in Germany, but there's the issue of Japan. And again, we make more and more concessions, especially with Eastern Europe, especially, okay, we will acquiesce. You can have a communist government in Poland. It actually starts out, you can have communists in the government that turns into a communist government. We acquiesce, okay, that's kind of your sphere of influence. There's not much we can do. Why? Because we need guarantees that the Soviet Union will enter the war against Japan. Which is why we say, okay, you can now expand in the East. You can get Manchuria. You can once again have influence over Korea. And you could possibly even have the northern part of Japan. Just get in the war. Now, the one good thing that comes out of this is we solidify plans for a United Nations. This idea, let's have something less broken than the League of Nations, where people can actually go solve their problems and maybe prevent some sort of national or, international catastrophe. Will it be successful? I mean, there wasn't a nuclear war in the Cold War, so maybe, At the same time, we begin sketching out, we're going to talk about this more next time. We begin crafting occupation zones. And already from February 45, you can see the hot spot. There's Britain to the north. France, because they were one of the original Allied powers, will throw them a bone. The United States and the Soviet Union. Everybody gets a not quite equal share. Nobody likes France. But here's the problem. The tiny NBC logo-like thing. That's Berlin that you see in the middle part of the big red splotch. Berlin was itself to be divided with a French, British, American, and Soviet zone. Nobody is really thinking this is a problem because nobody's really thinking once the war is over, this alliance system is going to collapse. This should not have been a problem. But the seeds for confrontation are going to be there. And this issue, the issue of Berlin, is going to be a problem all the way up until the end of 1989. Okay, this is going to be the main hotspot in the Cold War. We see that as this is going, okay, as the Germans begin moving through, or, retreating, and the Soviets begin moving through, Vienna, which, at this point had been part of Germany since 1938, is relatively safe. The townspeople have no problem welcoming them as liberators. But Germany was an entirely different case. The Germans knew exactly what would happen. You do not kill millions of people, burn down villages, massacre women and children, and then when you lose, expect to get off scot-free. Many begin fleeing to the west, trying to escape the Soviets. And Soviet troops begin looting, destroying, pillaging, and raping their way through Nazi Germany. Many of this was seen as retribution, as vengeance. I've seen a statistic that said that pretty much women 7 to 70, none of them were safe. And Soviet officers turned a blind eye and let it happen. Okay, this was to, effectively teach Germany a lesson. Because the Soviets had all this pent-up anger, this pent-up anguish that was just vented at the German people. And so what I hope to impress upon you with this, Germany is utterly destroyed as a result of this war. Hitler commits suicide, Berlin falls, and Berlin is basically blasted to hell, and May the 7th, Germany will surrender. Why this is important, okay, is not only is the division of Germany mean that now you're going to have a political confrontation with all of these powers that may or may not agree, but if Germany is absolutely destroyed, both through Soviet military aggression as well as Allied bombing. Bear in mind, since 1942, we have been dropping 500 and 1,000-pound bombs all over Germany, just sprinkling them all over. I just tried to think of a bad analogy, but it didn't work. We've been doing that so much. Germany is absolutely destroyed. And these are the problems. at the height of the Potsdam Conference. The Potsdam Conference, 1945, where now you have British Prime Minister Clement Attlee, American President Harry S. Truman, Joseph Stalin is there, and the guy right behind Stalin on the right is Minister Molotov, the same guy with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This is the start of the Cold War. The Potsdam Conference, this is where the Cold War begins. Because it's here that they start dividing Europe. The Soviets want to take German industry, move it back to the Soviet Union as reparations. We've got to rebuild our economy. The United States, we don't want to pay for Germany. We don't want to have to pay to rebuild it. But at the same time, we're looking back to Versailles and we're saying, what happened the last time there was a power vacuum? We want to avoid that mistake. There's also the issues. Okay, this is where we can see the alliance system starts to fall apart. Truman, at the Potsdam Conference, okay, and I'll talk about this more when we're going to actually have a lecture. I'm talking about technology, nuclear bomb stuff, but while this is going on, the Gadget has been tested. The Gadget is the world's first atomic weapon. It's detonated at Trinity, New Mexico. Okay, the first atomic bomb is not blown up over Hiroshima. It's Trinity, New Mexico. And Truman receives a coded message while he's at Potsdam that says the baby is born. And what he does, he goes to Stalin, as a good ally would, and he says, Comrade Stalin, we have developed a weapon that can vaporize an entire city and we believe can end this war quickly. And Stalin, through an interpreter, basically says, I know. Soviet spies in the United States had already found out about the Manhattan Project. They had already uncovered that we were developing an atomic weapon. And so what we're going to see is now distrust, the alliance falls apart, and we begin to divide Europe. We say, okay, we don't like it, but you can have Poland. Okay? The Soviets more or less, can have Poland as a sphere of influence. Poland itself gets German territory. Okay, they literally start taking off part of Germany. Think of East Prussia, Königsberg. That becomes part of Poland. And Poland, in kind of a war crime that people don't hear about, begins expelling German nationals, sending them to Germany saying, out you go. Truman, who, FDR had wanted those friendly relations, but Truman wanted a hardline stance. Truman did not want to have to worry about communist expansion. We're going to see things that nobody even thinks of, like Indochina, okay, is going to be partitioned. Where the hell did that come from? Remember, France loses its empire. France is going to want that back. But there's the realization, okay, that the Viet Minh, okay, who have been fighting the Japanese and want a Vietnamese national organization, they've been, they're not necessarily going to want, they're not going to necessarily want to go back to being a French colony. So they begin partitioning part of it off. We see that the Western Allies say, okay, we don't like it, but the provisional government of Poland, the Soviet-dominated one, is the legitimate government of Poland. The Polish exiles were good, they fought well, but they are not the legitimate government. And what this basically does is say that the Soviets dominate Eastern Europe and the West recognizes that. At some level, this is a total victory for Stalin. It does ensure that the Soviets will come into the war, but this is otherwise a total victory. What I want to do briefly is just finish out World War II, and again, just in brief explain why we use the atomic bomb, because that's the other piece of the pie. The political conditions are set. Now we need the spark to kick off the Cold War. And what we see here is we have developed the atomic bomb. Other people were trying to do the same. The Germans were trying it as well. We beat them. Okay? We use it, however, because we realize that an invasion of Japan is going to be too costly. There are too many kamikaze attacks. Okay? Myself, my grandfather on the battleship Mississippi, a kamikaze smashed into his battle about, 25, 30 feet from his battle station. If a Japanese pilot had been, 5 feet better with his aim, I wouldn't be here. And that's happening again and again and again. In Operation Ketsu Go, what this is, okay, the Japanese are training young female schoolgirls how to use bamboo spears, telling them, okay, run onto the invasion beach, stab an American soldier, kill him before he kills you, and if every one of you kill an American soldier, you can save Japan. A Japanese anti-tank weapon at this point would be a shaped charge on a bamboo stick that you would pop into the side of an American tank. And it blows up, the tank blows up, you blow up, but that's all you can do. If we just look at the sheer amount of people, okay, civilians are committing suicide on Saipan and Okinawa in the tens of thousands. Japanese garrisons are suffering 95% dead. They're fighting to the last. And so when you have Operation Downfall, which is two invasions of Japan, one in 1945, the other near Tokyo in 1946, there's the realization this is going to cause a stupid amount of casualties. The projections, and I mean no disrespect to the people who say that the atomic bombs were completely unjustified. I mean no disrespect to the people that say the Japanese were tired and wanted to surrender. But that's not really true. Okay? And I will attempt to prove that here in the next few minutes. One, our projected estimates were 267,000 dead and another million wounded. To put that in perspective, 50% more Americans would die in World War II than already did die in World War II as a result of this invasion alone. We suffer about 500,000 dead. This was going to increase that number half again. 1 million wounded. We knew of stuff, the kamikazes, the civilians throwing themselves off cliffs at Saipan. We know of Ketsu Go. We're saying this is going to cost between 5 and 10 million Japanese lives. And Truman, after Iwo Jima, after Okinawa, says the atomic bomb has to be a better alternative. This will actually save lives. Now, the Manhattan Project, it's really expensive. $2 billion. That's about $26 trillion today. It is highly secretive. The Soviets might know it, but when Truman is Roosevelt's vice president, Truman does not know of its existence. But we see that when this is detonated, when the gadget is detonated on July 16, 1945, I can prove to you that politicians are stupid. Because some of the Oppenheimer scientists said there is a small chance that when this detonates, it will start a chain reaction and incinerate the atmosphere. Now, it was a small chance, you can't prove it, And the politicians' response was, and I kid you not, we spent $2 billion building this thing. We've got to give the taxpayers something for their money. Okay? Hey, if it blows up the atmosphere, hey, we still win the war, so I guess it's not all bad. But never think politicians aren't stupid. There's also the fact that many said never explode this because the secret will be out. If you detonate this, and this is Trinity, a millisecond after detonation, if you blow this up, the secret is out, the world will know. And once that happens, everyone's going to try to build a bomb. The fact is, the Soviets, people said, look, the Soviet Union has been destroyed by the war. They're not going to invest money in this if they don't know how to work. But if you tell them it can be done, then of course they're going to build the weapon. And now I want to, I've included in the next slide for you just some statistics about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but I'm not really going to burden you with them. But I want to talk just a couple of stories about the kind of world that we're now entering into. In New Mexico, obviously nobody had seen an atomic blast before. And so when this detonates, it's far bigger than people expect. It's far brighter than people expect. And there's a story of a young girl who was in a town where you could actually see the flash. And the girl was blind. She had been, I guess, born with a birth defect, whatever, had been blind her whole life. the girl never saw anything in her life except on July the 16th, 1945, when she tugs on her mom's skirt and says, "Mommy, what was that?" The only thing this young girl ever sees is the flash of an atomic bomb. We have split the atom. We have entered a new scientific age. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, believe it or not, are not that deadly. In March 1945, during Operation Meeting House, using incendiaries with 330 planes, we destroy Tokyo. 100,000 dead, a quarter of the city gone, 1 million homeless. This, not Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is the deadliest air raid in history. Hiroshima kills only about 66,000, more still with the radiation. Nagasaki, 40,000. It's that now we've gone from 330 planes and thousands of bombs to one plane, one bomb, and the very distinctive mushroom cloud. And so I want to leave off with a couple things. I want to talk about this man, Tsutomu Yamaguchi. Tsutomu Yamaguchi is either the unluckiest person in human history or the luckiest person in human history, however you want to, slice it. He'd been in Hiroshima on business, where he was a few miles from ground zero when the first atomic bomb detonated. And he suffered burns, he was wounded, and he spent the rest of August the 6th. He spent the time recuperating. And then on the 7th he leaves, and he says, what I assume is the equivalent to, the Japanese equivalent to F this, gets out of town. And it's a couple of days' journey, because, Japan has been blown to hell. And he arrives home on August the 9th, where, in his hometown of Nagasaki, he is again a couple of miles from ground zero. He is the only confirmed person to have survived both atomic bombings. We think that there might have been several, maybe even dozens, who survived Hiroshima that then died at Nagasaki. There might have been a few others that survived the initial explosions of Hiroshima and Nagasaki but then died of radiation. He is the only confirmed one. Now, why I say that the atomic bombs might have been necessary is for Emperor Hirohito, the godlike emperor of Japan. This was enough. This was enough to pack it in and say, "I'm done." But Hirohito, Hirohito records a surrender message to be played to his people, saying, "Look, we've got to stop the war. I can't stand to see my citizens suffer." Truman is saying, "We're going to keep dropping bombs day after day, vaporizing cities. We don't have any more. We have literally exploded all 3 bombs we could make. We're not going to be able to make more until 1946. Japan agrees to surrender. The same day as Hiroshima, the same day as Nagasaki, August the 9th, the Soviets cross the border and invade Manchuria. Despite all of that, the Japanese army, in control of the government, launches a coup. The army wants to keep fighting. The army is fine with committing suicide as a nation. So my argument to you is, if the army is willing to cross their emperor whom they revere as a god and go against his wishes to keep fighting in the face of nuclear weapons, then yes, an invasion would have been necessary. Japan instead, however, the coup is put down, the surrender message is played on August the 15th, and on September the 2nd, the Second World War comes to an end. But what now happens, and what we're going to really talk about next time, though I realize because the last lecture was about an hour, this one's about an hour, I'll probably just post some videos for you to watch to give you a break tomorrow. What all of this means, if we take it into account, is the Soviets have been transformed. Within years, they go from a backwater empire, well, not even an empire, they have more tanks than anybody else. They have a larger army than anybody else. They have a professional army, the largest air force. They have been unified, if not under the spirit of communism, under the spirit of Za Rodina, for the motherland. You now have the Soviet Union as a superpower. And right across the border from it, You have another superpower, a United States, now fully removed from the Great Depression, now armed, equipped, now fully not just a world power as we had been after World War I, but now a superpower. And into that mix of a capitalist superpower and a communist superpower staring at each other, you now have atomic weapons. And what this means is any future war has the potential to be much, much more deadly. And there becomes the question then, can the two superpowers coexist? And especially coexist now trying to figure out what's going to happen in the political climate of Europe. And so it's those questions I'll leave off till next time. So I'm sorry this ran a little long. I like to keep them shorter, but I can, when I start talking, I don't know how to shut up. So thanks for laying along. Take it easy. And next time we'll start talking about the book reviews, how that works. I might actually post a video about that tomorrow, then some documentaries, and then we'll pick up next week. If you have any questions, let me know. Have a good one, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.